Well, thank you for coming. I'm really excited to have the chance to talk to you all about this book and hopefully just promote lots of conversation amongst all of the families. Hopefully, will go out and continue these conversations later on. This book has been a very big part of my journey to teaching, and it's something that I read senior year of college while I was doing my student teaching and then forgot about until this year. I took it up again to read it in the fall, and it was so impactful that I bought a couple copies for my fellow teachers, and we've been reading it together and discussing it throughout this year because it's so beautiful. And she was reading it and said, I'm not a parent yet, but if I were a parent, this book would profoundly change the way I think I would think about parenting. And I said, yeah, that kind of makes sense. And we said, wow, maybe parents would want to read this book with us and talk about why we're doing the things that we're doing here. And that's where the idea was born. And I'm really grateful that you all wanted to talk about it with me. So I guess I wanted to start with talking about what is classical education, because classical is not a word you will find in this book. It is not discussed anywhere. You will not find classical. You will not find liberal arts. You will not find Christianity. This book is about morality and virtue, but it does not specifically state that it is part of the classical education movement, and yet it shares all of the same goals, I think. Talking with people from many, many different schools and backgrounds as to what this classical education is, and so many of the conversations revolve around curriculum. And particularly for those perhaps not intimately familiar with classical education who could just give me a off-the-cuff definition, I just hear great books-oriented, Latin, the trivium, so grammar, logic, and rhetoric, the kind of the staple classes that we associate with a classical education, an older education. And so I'm ecstatic to hear you mentioning virtue. Hearing that as something coming from the kids, because that's not related to, it is related to curriculum, absolutely, but not summed up in curriculum choices. Work ethic, joy, these are all part of these things, and this is why I believe this book so well explains the core of what classical education is about, because this book is about the virtues that must be present in someone trying to bring about virtues in someone else. So this book mostly talks about parenting or teaching, but in the preface and the introduction, which we'll read together, it talks about how parents, coaches, pastors, all of those who are trying to get involved in that effort of bringing about something in a person, that they have to first have that present in themselves. So the book has several chapters, each based around an attribute. So we have learning, authority, ethics, order, imagination, compassion, patience, character, and pleasure. In really broad strokes terms, I'm looking at classical education as the education of the whole person to become more fully human, which, we could interpret that in lots of ways. So, but I mean by the education of the whole person, it takes into account the things that particularly you mentioned of, it's not about intellectual prowess alone or vocabulary or analytical skills, but it's also about work ethic. It's also about kindness. It's about, I teach teenagers largely. I teach in the upper school. So for me, classical education is about psychological balance. I have a lot of angsty preteens in my classroom daily, and sometimes in order to make them a whole person, I need to dedicate 15 minutes to unpacking the dramatic thing that happened in the morning. And just knowing that me pushing forward in the Iliad when they're really, really stuck on something dramatic that somebody said at lunch is not actually educating them fully, because we won't be present for that. It will be a wasted effort. And so talking about the thing they heard or read or saw is helping them become a more fully formed human being in that moment. So it's holistic is a word often used, I think, a holistic education. Some of you were there for my Coffee with the Classics morning, and I talked about why I spend so much time on poetry and prayer in my classroom, is that by spending sometimes a lot of my English period on prayer, I'm trying to form a particular part of my students, a part of empathy, a part of that habit of turning to the Lord in prayer in times of trouble. So that's just as much the focus of my classical education as is the literature that I'm teaching. And so this book says, and we'll read, it says that it will be completely ignoring methods of teaching. It's not here to deal with this at all. We're not, particularly because how much that can change by classroom to classroom, from age group to age group, subject to subject. But what is constant is the kind of person we want to create on the other side of our education, the kind of virtues and habits of soul we want to see in those students, and how it is unreasonable for us to ask them to be exemplifying those things if we are not exhibiting it to them. Students, well, all people are so, they tend towards mimicry. we want to become like the things that we spend time around, which of course is something I spend a lot of time talking to teenagers about. I'm sure you parents do as well, that you become like the company you keep. And so if I want to produce a kind of student who lives in habits of virtue, they spend a lot of time in my company. So I need to be that, so that they will become more like that and encourage each other in that. But Banner and Cannon have the wiser words between them and me, so we can just begin reading for them. So this is starting on Roman numeral 7, preface. This book is about teaching, and because it is about teaching, much of it is devoted to the personal qualities of good teachers. Believing that teaching is an art, we have emphasized the artists who practice it. This does not mean that we are unmindful of the science of teaching. As with every other art, mastery of teaching is gained through close attention to methods and materials, as well as to refinement of native gifts. Yet, we have focused on the qualities, both natural and cultivated, of those who teach, rather than on the techniques they use, because far too much attention has been given to explaining the process of teaching, and not nearly enough to describing the peoples responsible for that process. Those people cannot be separated from what they do. The human factor in teaching is infinitely variable and beyond the reach of scientific inquiry. It is that factor, rather than the professional one, that is the subject of this book. We have written it for those who teach and for those who wish to consider what makes up the art of teaching and learn to recognize its achievement. Who specifically do we have in mind as our readers? Firstly, those who are considering teaching as a career or just beginning to teach, who need to know both the demands of their chosen work and the deep satisfaction of its pursuit and mastery. Veteran teachers, practiced in their ways and classroom characters, who may need reassurance about the value, indeed sometimes the glory, of their efforts, and who may also seek the inspiration and encouragement to evaluate their old habits and to consider new ones. Those many people, parents, students, administrators, members of governing boards, and public officials who evaluate teaching for personal or professional reasons. And those many others who, with no less seriousness of intent or moral concern than professional teachers, occasionally instruct other people in unfamiliar tasks. Parents, police officers, managers, counselors, coaches, and all professionals, in fact, anyone and everyone. I think they speak to a beautiful truth in that all of us are teaching. I like how they end that with anyone and everyone, because anyone and everyone is at some point teaching others. I think this is the calling to make disciples of all nations. We are teaching others in everything that we do as Christians of what God is, what Christianity is, and what the Christian looks like. So we are all called to be teachers. And all of you as parents particularly, absolutely. How much more profound are you experiencing this calling that I have of molding souls? You've been at it a lot longer than I and have a much longer impact, I think, on your children than I ever will. So how much more relevant is this for you? This reminds me actually of a conversation I had in college with a fellow student. We were reflecting on what we considered the gravest vocations, the ones with the perhaps most serious impact. And we decided on parenting, pastoring, and teaching. These three that, not that other vocations didn't leave an impactful or leave an impact on the world, but somehow these three, their medium is the souls of other people. And parents forever decide the way that their children will look at the world. Perhaps not in the way that they intended. But I mean, I assume all of us can look at our childhoods and see that, or our even continuing relationship with our parents, that we look at the world because of the way they looked at the world. And maybe not in the same way that they did, but still because of how they did. Pastors, because of the fact that they take up this place as the intermediary between Christ and his church, reading the word, interpreting that for the church, and due to human frailty, the pastors become the image of Christ, I think, to many people, the image of what it means to be a Christian. And I'm sure we'd all say that we need to be looking at Jesus as that, but as humans, we tend to need something more focal that we can focus on. And then teachers as well. I can look back. The reason I decided that I was called to be a teacher was in a moment where looking back and realizing that I was who I was because of the teachers I had had, particularly in high school and college, and that I'd gone through lots of potential career paths and majors, pre-med and bio, theology, Latin, history, and it was in history, my sophomore year of college, that I was able to take a truly fantastic upper-level class on the Reformation. I love the Reformation. I could talk about it all day long, and I loved the professor. He was really impactful for me, and I took this class, and within a couple weeks, I just hated it. I knew that this was not the subject material, not the professor, it was just the subject itself. I thought, I cannot do this. If the other 2.5 years of college are taking these classes, I will never survive. And I had a crisis. I'd already declared as a history major, and a wise mentor for me helped me discern that it wasn't history, it was the history professor. It wasn't bio, had been the bio teacher in high school. It wasn't theology, it was the deacon at my church who taught the classes I took. It was the teachers who had come alongside me that made me fall in love with those subjects, and I really had fallen in love with their education that they were giving me. And that's how it became clear as day. It was teaching that I was called to, not necessarily history. And those teachers have forever made me who I am. I tell my students all the time how many of my mannerisms of teaching come from those teachers. And I think I've heard lots of people tell me about their teachers that they've had and how those teachers are so responsible for who they've become in many different ways. So all of us, parents, teachers, pastors, whatever, incredible role we have. There's a little bit left on this page and the next to read, I think. Talking about their reasons for writing this book, which I appreciate. The book originates in our personal experiences. It represents the distillation of 2 lifetimes of teaching in many settings, from an elementary school classroom in the slums of Southeast London to graduate seminars in an Ivy League university. Yet, it is in no sense a memoir. It contains no references to personal history. It is instead, as Gilbert Hyatt characterized his own penetrating art of teaching, quote, a book of suggestions drawn from practice, end quote. Because the book is intended to highlight the qualities that make up great teaching, we have thought it useful to illustrate the form and shape which these qualities may take in classrooms with the portrait of teachers, good and bad, exemplary and cautionary, at work. While the characters are fictional, they are by no means figments of our fancy. We have drawn their traits and tactics from teachers we have known and from our own experiences. We wish the sketches to demonstrate teaching in progress, a living process full of teachers' faults, foibles, mistakes, quirks, fancies, and blemishes, as well as their virtues and triumphs. No single person to our knowledge has ever possessed all the virtues or vices we portray, but all these attributes of teachers have existed somewhere, sometime. By illustrating with concrete examples the general element of which we have written, we hope to help make somewhat abstract qualities come to life. Finally, every idea in this book rests on our conviction that, for those who pursue it seriously, teaching is a calling, a summons from within, that it is among life's noblest and most responsible activities, an activity in which we have all engaged at one time or another as parents, workers, and friends, and that those who teach with fullness of heart and complete engagement are entitled to every honor and support that their communities can extend. Thus, we hope to find as readers those who wish to understand, as we have tried to understand, good teaching wherever and however it occurs. We have written for all, like ourselves, who would gladly learn, that gladly they might better teach. So just like in the preface, they lead off, Banner and Cannon, with the same thought in the introduction that most teachers forget that teaching is an art. So by art, I think they're differentiating from a science, or here technology, they say. Trained in the sciences and techniques of education, professional teachers are conscientious in applying the psychology and methods that they have learned. They may not call what they are trying to do teaching, and may prefer instead such terms as explanation, instruction, demonstration, guidance, or simply setting a good example. Yet even those who have enjoyed first-class professional preparation, when summoned to instruct, guide, and inform those entrusted to them, are faced with one of the greatest, because earliest, challenges of teaching. They must improvise as best they can. I would assume this is true of parenting as well. Unless you happen to have read many, many parenting books, I imagine a lot of it seems as improvising. as they rarely get it right the first time. How true is that for the teacher? Only after much repetition, some nervous invention, occasional losses of temper, and general frustration do their own processes of learning lurch forward. Then they lick their wounds and, perhaps wondering why they were ever willing to try to teach anyone anything in the first place, they gradually perfect their art. Some teachers, whether professional or amateur, may never manage to get it right. Some may fail to teach anyone anything important at all. Even those many of us who teach more or less effectively are often overwhelmed by justifiable concern for our lesson plans and their implementation, by getting our students through our courses, and by negotiating the politics and administrative obligations that seem inherent in any calling as burdened with responsibilities as teaching. Consequently, we often simply fail to give sustained and collegial thought to teaching's broader components. This may be because we prepare for our calling by learning the subjects we will teach and the methods by which we will teach them, and there is nothing wrong with that. Yet, rarely if ever, are we led to reflect on those dimensions of character and mind that are the very core of what we do, which is to help others acquire both the knowledge by which they can understand life in all its fullness and the dispositions by which they can live such a life. I'll stop there because that's the definition of education. Right there, starting with the M dash. I think it's not a bad definition of classical education either, so I'll read it again. So starting at the M dash, education, and perhaps classical education, is helping others acquire both the knowledge by which they can understand life and its fullness, and the dispositions by which they can live such a life. Dispositions, I think, meaning habits. Dispositions, the thing to which you tend toward. So virtue is the word for habit of virtue, a habit of soul. So essentially, what it's saying is the knowledge required to understand life and the habits and virtues required. Again, holistic, the whole person, not just the knowledge. I think the tendency we have in education, right, to think about simply the knowledge that you need. And even then, they say not the knowledge you need to be employed, not the knowledge that you need to pay your taxes, but the knowledge that you can understand life in all of its fullness. What a calling to understand life in all its fullness. I'm in the process of that, I suppose. I couldn't tell you how far along, but so this is what we're trying to do in our students. We want them to acquire this knowledge, to understand life in its fullness, and to have the disposition to live that kind of life in all of its fullness. I think it echoes the calling of Christ that he came that we might have life and have it to the fullness, or abundantly, depending on how you translate that. But life in its fullness is his gift to us, and we in classical education are trying to give people that. At a place like Oakdale, we are a Christian classical school. My student education was in Hillsdale Academy, which was not explicitly Christian. It was, as I think you used the term, Emmy, the Judeo-Christian tradition, yes, but not explicitly Christian. And I think some people are really concerned about that what are you doing if it's not explicitly Christian? I think that if you're really trying to do classical education, which is do this, I think, give someone the understanding of life in its fullness, you are trying to give someone the gift that Christ gives us and are therefore doing the Christian work. I think that we have a lot of charter schools out there that in the public sphere are trying to do this, and what an uphill battle that must be to fight for virtue and absolute truth and goodness in a world that's asking us to not make definitive statements about those things. But I think nevertheless the work that is being done is Christian in its very nature without it needing the label, without it needing to be defined as that. I think it would be much harder to do that, but I think the goals of what you're doing remain the same, largely. And so I just consider myself blessed to be doing the thing that I would be doing at a charter school, I would be doing in a public school that wasn't a classical charter school if I were there. I would be doing in a parochial school, I would be doing there. I just have the luxury of being able to use a Christian vocabulary that I wouldn't be able to use otherwise. But the nature of the work remains the same. I had a beautiful conversation with a Hillsdale student recently who is a hopeful Latin teacher. And I asked him this question. I asked him if I gave him a Latin 1 class, how would it be different for him at a public school as it would at Oakdale or at a Christian school? And he thought, and he said, I don't know if it would be different, because I would still be doing the same thing. I'd still be trying to teach truth through the medium of this language to my students. And why would that need to be different in other places? And I thought that was beautiful a little naive but beautiful. That what he's understanding that the point here is the extension, the handing off of truth and goodness and beauty, these attributes that find their fullness in God, that they are all given to us by God. They are God's attributes, and they exist in anyone who's trying to do this work, whether or not they are able to say that they're coming from God and from Christ's gift to us. I thought that was beautiful.
One of the things I'm trying to teach my kids how to think. It's one of the beautiful things about the Christian faith is that God calls us to use our minds and to think. We're not to be indoctrinated. So
Sure.
I see a difference between just indoctrinating my children versus teaching them to think, because if they can think and learn how to reason, Christianity is a religion that it's the truth.
Yeah.
So if they're pursuing what is true, like that's my hope, because then they will find God at the end.
Absolutely.
You know, if they know how to think and they know how to reason, they know what is true, Christ is the answer.
Sure.
So I have the questioning and all that is a very good and healthy and right
Absolutely.
thing to do. And classical education does that. It trains them how
Sure.
to think. It's not just a Christian school where if you go to a Christian school and you're not taught classically, maybe you're just being indoctrinated.
Sure.
And then you leave and you don't know how to think.
Yeah.
And then where indoctrination doesn't do anything.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think classical schools, for example, charter schools, let's say, taking place in the public sphere, they can get in trouble because their education points toward Christianity, and often their students become curious and want to talk about those things and perhaps, convert to Christianity in certain circumstances. And then, that's troublesome in the public sphere. And the question is, well, what was the teacher saying that they should have been saying? Were they leading secret Bible studies? And no, I think, as you said, if we're teaching the truth, the students will find it. And we know where that truth is. We know that Jesus is the truth, and therefore if we're teaching it, we will lead them to him in God's time. And we can have an accelerated path, perhaps, in a Christian school where we're able to use more explicit vocabulary, but nevertheless, are we not on the same road in all of these places if we're teaching the truth? This is a holistic education that takes into account all that a human being is. And to just give someone the answer to the question ignores the fact that they are a questioning being. Made in the image and likeness of a creator. And so we have that in us as well, the desire to understand and to make and to not just to be told, but to understand and know deeply. So in this education that wants to take all of that into account, it would be antithetical to just give you the answers and just say this is what you should think and not take into account why you should think it, or take into account that you will want to know why you have to think it. Absolutely, this is all part of the same thing. Would you read for me, please, the basic element of teaching?
The basic elements of teaching, by contrast, are qualities that come to inhere in us, even if we do not recognize them as such or fully develop them. Rarely can they be taught. They are ingredients of our own humanity, to which contents and methods are adjunct. We must draw them from ourselves, identify, develop, and then apply them. We may know our subjects and perfect our techniques for teaching them without recognizing that. For our mastery to make a difference to our students, we must also summon from within certain qualities of personality that have little to do with subject matters or theories of instruction. We don't learn these qualities, we call them forth, and by understanding them, we use them for the benefit of others.
Thank you. As you can see, I underlined that line. I just think that's beautiful. I think that takes into account what we just said about being made in the image and likeness of our Creator, that we have these things at our disposal, these virtues. We have these things as gifts of the Holy Spirit. We have them as part of who we are. And in our weakness as humans, we might struggle with them, but they're nevertheless part of what it means to be human, that we have to call forth in order to show our students that they can call those things forth, the things that we will read on.
Okay. Pedagogical expertise and technical knowledge are essential to it. Ultimately, teaching is a creative act. It makes something fresh from existing knowledge in spontaneous, improvised efforts of mind and spirit, disciplined by education and experience. Thus, unlike a technology in which correct application produces predictable and uniform results, teaching yields infinite surprises, infinite delights from one moment to the next. While method can apply to teaching, we know or can learn what art can finish out of our own selves. We must imagine and then practice.
Thank you. So this is what I mentioned at the very beginning when he talks about teaching being an art. It's different than in technology. It's not a predictable, action that will produce a predictable result. And thanks be to God for that. I think that despite moments of failure to provide the best education that we can, that good things come from it. And I think it also can explain the frustration that I know I experienced as a teacher, and I'm sure parents do as well, that sometimes the effort that you put into it doesn't result in what you thought it would, or how the same parents can produce such dramatically different children in their adulthood. I think what we're doing here is an art with all the skills that we bring to it, but with no ability to rely on it as a technology. It will not create predictable and uniform results, and in fact just leads to surprises, disappointments, but also, as I said, infinite delights that we also know come from the fact that these are not our children, but Christ's, and that we have been gifted them for the time that we have been to use our art of influence and to create as beautiful of a human as we can. That seems like a good place to end.